There's a lot of evidence that supports the concept that evolution has happened on Earth, and that's what we want to talk about right now. Evolution is the idea that living things have changed over time. The Earth seems to be a lot older than the Bible indicates. If you extrapolate backwards using biblical time frames, the Earth is less than 30,000 years old. But the discovery of fossils in rock that appear to be much older confounded early biologists in the 17 and 1800s. Um, Fossils are one of the biggest pieces of evidence that uh, evolutionists hold as clear evidence that evolution's taken place on Earth. So fossils hinted that the Earth has been very old, and animals that once lived here are no longer here today. And the fossil record shows that most life forms that have ever lived, more than 99%, are now extinct. Now, fossils are generally found in rock, with almost no exceptions. There are three kinds of rock. Igneous rock almost never contains fossils. Occasionally, there are fossils in igneous rock. Igneous rock is solidified molten lava, or it can be pumice from a volcanic eruption. There are, for example, at Pompeii, when the town of Pompeii was hammered by Mount Vesuvius, not long after the 0 AD, actually, the people in the town they died in their homes, and their bodies were preserved inside the lava and pumice that was raining down on them. But that is rather rare. Sedimentary rock often contains lots of fossils. The difference here is igneous rock is basically comes from volcanic activity, and it's solidified a molten lava. It used to be real hot and it was liquid and it flowed or it flew through the air from a volcanic eruption. And then it cooled down and it turned into solid rock. Generally speaking, because of that, the nature of its origin, it usually doesn't have fossils in it. On the other hand, sedimentary rock is made from sediment, fine dust particles, usually settling in a body of water to the bottom in layers. So usually sedimentary rock has the most fossils in any given area. Uh, it doesn't seem possible, but the layers of muck at the bottom of the ocean, as they pile on top of each other, they slowly do solidify into solid rock. Limestone, dolomite, sandstone, and mudstone all have all kinds of fossils in them. And Missouri is full of limestone and dolomite, and we have lots of fossils in our limestone and dolomite. Metamorphic rock, it depends. Metamorphic rock is sedimentary rock that ended up getting pushed down towards the base of the crust of the earth, and it got exposed to superheat and pressure, and a lot of the fossils that are there get destroyed. But that's what produced our coal and petroleum that we run our cars and heat our houses with today. Metamorphic rock, so in coal deposits, there are, fossils, but not as many as there were before it became metamorphic. So metamorphic rock is sedimentary rock that went through change. I want to point out, really, all rock on this planet started out igneous. Earth was quite a hot ball a long time ago when it was first formed. And as igneous rock erodes, it forms superfine dust. That tends to accumulate in bodies of water like lakes and oceans to form sedimentary layers, which then become sedimentary rock. And that sedimentary rock can contain dead stuff, dead living things that settled in it. And if some of that sedimentary rock gets exposed to high heat and pressure from the base of the crust of the earth, it can become metamorphic. So all the rock layers are actually related to one another. Here you can see, and this is a typical rock formation in Montana. And here's another rock formation. This is the Triassic period in Utah, and you can see layers. This used to be the bottom of an ocean. This used to be the bottom of an ocean, and those are all sedimentary layers that settled out a long, long time ago. So the geologic time scale has in it sort of a clock in the rocks. The geologic record is the history of the earth written in the rocks. The history of the earth is first divided into eras. and then it's subdivided into periods, and then it's further subdivided into epochs. So, for example, the Precambrian era is all the time before the Cambrian explosion. This line right here represents the Cambrian explosion, which is the explosion of life on Earth. The Paleozoic era is divided into the Cambrian period, which began it, and that's when animal life exploded on Earth. And then that's followed by the Ordovician period, and then the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, and the Permian. The Carboniferous is usually subdivided into the Pennsylvanian and the Mississippian, but that's another story. After the Paleozoic era, and this is the age of like the origin of all the major life animal forms on Earth, then came the Mesozoic era, which is the age of the dinosaurs, starting around almost 250 million years ago after the Permian extinction, and going to about 65 million years ago. So that's close to 200 million years. The dinosaurs ruled the world. Mammals show up during this time, but are just afterfarts of evolution. We were sort of like frogs back then, very small, diminutive, and food for the dinosaurs. But right here on this line is a major extinction that occurred. It's called the KT boundary line. That's the extinction period that we think wiped the dinosaurs out and set the stage for another group of animals to take over dominance of the world. And so the Cenozoic era, which is the last one that we have in our history, is the age of mammals, and that's where mammals dominate the planet. So you can see down here the events that dominate in each of the periods of these major eras. So the major eras that you're responsible for are Precambrian, and then the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Now, proportionately, time is not evenly divided among these eras. Okay, so if the Earth is formed here, and we put the time frame on a circular dial, the red, the pink, and the yellow are all the Precambrian period. So most of the history of the Earth is Precambrian. And by the time the Earth goes through the Hadean, and then the Archean, and then the Proterozoic, Earth has gotten as far as slime. But something happened around 550 million years ago that changed the playing field, and suddenly multicellular life starts to pop up, both in the plant, fungi, and animals, in all three groups actually. The Paleozoic era then is the origin and the flourishing of lots of major animal groups, including the reptiles, the amphibians, the fishes, and then plants. The very primitive plants, the mosses, and then after that the ferns and the seedless vascular plants, and then after that came the gymnosperms, which dominated during the Mesozoic era. So this is where the dinosaurs rule the world here. And then this little orange strip is where the mammals rule the world. So you can see mammals haven't been around ruling the world for very long proportionately. Earth has been around for 4.6 maybe billion years, and that little sliver is mammals dominating. Human dominating isn't even the thickness of that black line at the end of the circular wheel here. So the history of the Earth is really not evenly divided among all these periods. It's divided among what was happening in the evolution of life on Earth. There's the critical to fossils are their age. Like, when was the organism alive that made the fossil? So there's two ways to date a fossil: relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating relies on rock position, where you find the fossil in the rock layer. So this fossil right here is a younger fossil than a fossil down here. The lower layers are older, upper layers are younger. So the lower you find a fossil in a rock layer, in a strata, this is called a strata, series of layers, the older the fossil is. So it is always important to note the specific location of where the fossil was found. Next, there's absolute dating. Absolute dating relies on, if they're present now, a radioactive isotope that's present in the fossil. The Shroud of Turin was actually dated that way. A half-life is a number of years, or minutes or seconds. It's the amount of time required for 1/2 of a radioactive sample to decay. The shorter the half-life, the more radioactive the substance is. There are some radioactive substances that have enormously long half-lives, like in terms of millions of years. So usually, like in the case of carbon-14, all animal and plant life on Earth accumulates carbon-14, which is radioactive carbon from the air around us. But when we die, we no longer accumulate it. So while we're alive, we tend to get a certain amount of carbon-14 in our bodies. But when we die, that carbon-14 starts to disappear. If you take a sample of a bone from a dead animal and look at how much carbon-14 is in it, that can give you a hint as to how many years ago that animal was actually alive. So, for example, if a human skull has 1/2 of the amount of radioactive carbon within it, then it is about 1 half-life old. That means that the skull is 5,770 years old, because it takes 5,770 years for 1/2 of a carbon-14 sample to decay. So if 1/2 of the carbon-14 sample in a skull has disappeared, then the skull is 1 half-life old, 5,770 years. We won't use this equation to calculate the age of a fossil, but instead we'll use a time frame, and I'll talk more about it in class. I won't go through it here, but if 1/4 of the amount of radioactive carbon was left in the fossil, then 2 half-lives would have passed, or the fossil would be closer to 11,400 years old. If 1/8 of the fossil remains, then it would be 3 half-lives old. 1/16 of the fossil remaining, 4 half-lives old, and so on and so forth. So we'll go through more of that later. But here's a table that kind of helps with this. It says, using the table to the right, if a fossil has 0.1 or 1/10 or 10% of its radioactivity still remaining, it has gone through more than 3 half-lives but less than 4 half-lives. So take a look at this. In 1/10, 0.1, 1/10 is between 1/8 and 1/16. So that means that that fossil is between 3 and 4 half-lives old. So if the half-life is 5,770 years, it's between 3 times 5770 and 4 times 5770 years old. This chart makes it real easy to estimate the age of a fossil by simply taking the fraction of the amount of carbon-14 that's remaining and comparing it to the half-life chart here. 1/2 remaining is 1 half-life. 1/4 remaining, 2 half-lives have gone by. 1/8 remaining, 3 half-lives have gone by. 1/16 remaining, 4 half-lives have gone on, and so on and so forth. So how do fossils form? The basic idea is that when something dies, it often, by the way, if you're in the forest and you die and your body rots away, you don't fossilize. So most forest-dwelling animals actually don't fossilize unless they fall in a river or a lake or the ocean. So if an organism dies and settles at the bottom of a body of water, sediment will slowly cover it up, because that's the nature of how sedimentary rock forms. And if the organism is submerged in muck, it will not decay because decomposition is hindered. It can't decay if there's no oxygen around, and the water in the muck will keep oxygen from reaching the dead body. Slowly but surely, the body of the organism will then be replaced by minerals from the water passing over it and through its body. We call this kind of fossilization replacement fossilization. So that's the kind of fossils that I collected from the Badlands of Montana, and I'll be handing those around in class. I have a Triceratops horn that I'll pass around. The horn is very heavy. It's heavier than it originally was, and that's because it's no longer bone, but it has the same structure of the bone that it used to have, and that's because all of the atoms of the bone, which were mainly carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, have been replaced with silicon, aluminum, and other atoms from the minerals that were present in the bone when it was stuck in the muck. Now, there are other kinds of fossils. Occasionally, you will find organic remains of actual once living things. Iceman was found in the Alps. Iceman was not a replacement fossil. Iceman's body was actually still organic, and it still had DNA in it. Okay, so that was actual organic remains fossils. Now they're rare. We think we'll have woolly mammoths walking on Earth within a decade or two, because the Russians have a whole herd that was frozen in an avalanche in Siberia, and the flesh is still preserved and the DNA is intact. And the hope is that we'll be able to clone them using elephant embryo or elephant eggs. Amber is tree sap, and that has trapped fossils, and sometimes they actually still have organic remains in them when they're recovered. That was the Jurassic Park concept, that you could take an amber preserved insect and pull out the contents of a mosquito stomach, and that would have dinosaur DNA in it that was sucked up by the mosquito when it sucked its blood. Next, we talked about these replacement fossils, or fossils cast in stone. Now, they're heavy, much heavier than the original fossil was. Real bone is actually very light, but when it becomes replaced with minerals, it becomes quite heavy. Sue, the tyrannosaur that was found in the Badlands of Montana, actually it was in South Dakota, is a replacement fossil. Bone is actually not solid, it's porous, and that's why it ends up getting replaced. Volcanic eruptions can cover organisms with volcanic ash and pumice, but in that case, usually, instead of getting a true replacement fossil, you get complete permineralization of the. In other words, the entire fossil gets so completely solidified in the atoms of the volcanic material that surrounds it. So we have some petrified wood. Petrification is a little different than fossil replacement with minerals, but in the end, you still have a replica of what was originally a living thing. The third type, mold fossils, are a little different. You really don't have the animal or plant itself, you have an imprint of it. This would be like a dinosaur track or a leaf imprint that was left in the ground. This is a mold fossil right here. That's not the actual shell of the scallop. That was the imprint left by the shell of the scallop. So in the end, you can have actual body parts, those are organic remains, or you can have replacement fossils, which are cast in some type of stone or volcanic material. Or you can have mold fossils, which are really not the actual fossil itself, but are an imprint of the original fossil organism. So just remember that the lower you go in a rock layer, the older the fossils get, and the fossil record is basically the sequence of fossils in the layer. The problems with the fossil record are numerous. I mean, the fossil record is not complete. There are all kinds of missing fossils. Many organisms don't get fossilized, especially like human ancestors, because we lived in forests and woodlands, and we didn't get covered up with muck in the ocean, and so we don't get preserved well. Now, after fossils, there's still all kinds of other evidence. Biogeography, that's the study of the geographic distribution of living things, that is not an even occurrence across the planet. You have all kinds of odd occurrences of species, especially on islands around the world. Why is that? Well, we think it's because of evolution and not through a specific instantaneous creation event. So organisms are not scattered across the globe without reason. Each continent has its own peculiar collection of species. Islands often have really strange species that are a microcosm of the nearest continent that provided the species. The Galapagos, for example, had no mammals on them because mammals don't make good sea voyagers, but they had reptiles, which do float out at sea for quite some time, and they had birds and insects. Rats have become a real problem on the islands, and rat extermination campaigns are constantly underway to try and keep the rats in check so they don't destroy the native wildlife. Biogeography shows that evolution produced different life forms in different areas, such as the marsupials of Australia, the giant tortoises of the Galapagos, polar bears in the Arctic, penguins in the Antarctic, etc. The next thing, embryological development. By the way, I should mention right before we do this, plate tectonic theory shows that we think the continents at one time were one giant landmass, as you see right here. And then that landmass separated into the continental landmasses that we have today. When the continents were all one giant landmass, animals could move freely around. But once the continents separated, animals on different continents evolved differently than one another. That was adaptive radiation and evolution of new species. So we have an American horse that became extinct around 7,000 years ago. The Great Plains, Kansas and Missouri, represent the origin of the horse, but the American horse went extinct. We don't know exactly why, but the European horse which radiated from America to Europe. When the landmass was connected, the European horse survived, and that's the horses we have today. Probably the American horse was not that dissimilar from the European horse. Now, embryology shows hints of evolution. Embryos of many different animals show common embryonic patterns of development. We believe this is because of common heritage. The ancient animal form that evolved into all the different animals on the earth evolved also all their embryological patterns. So, of course, animals share a common embryology. It's because they had a common ancestor. At least that's what we think. And then lastly, body structure. It is peculiar that humans have this little finger-like extension off the base of the colon. This is down in the lower right-hand side of your abdomen along your pelvic wall. It's a useless organ. The appendix kills some people. The appendix is a vestigial organ. Now, why would we have that if our ancestors didn't have it? We think that human ancestors used the appendix. There are animals that have this structure, but it's much longer, and they use it to digest roughage, like leaves. We don't do that anymore, so our appendix is shrinking away because of disuse. We simply don't use it. Natural selection isn't picking for good appendices anymore. It used to be called the cecum in other animals. Now we call it the appendix in us. I mean, why would whales have hind legs when they have no hind legs? But they have the bones coming off of their hind pelvis, but they're internal. They're there, but they're internal. We have muscles that move human ears, but we don't use them anymore. We think that the presence of those organs indicate an ancestor that did use those organs, and today they're simply not being used anymore in our particular species. And then lastly, comparative biochemistry indicates that proteins and DNA in very different organisms show common heritage that can be used to indicate relatedness. There are other lines of evidence that support evolution, but these are the big ones.